Hello everyone. In this video we will talk about the definition of a fascia and why it is so difficult to understand what fascia is. Mainly because of 6 what I call confusion points. After going through each of the confusion points, I will talk about open questions that still remain. And I will list some residual information that I encountered during my research about the fascia. And finally, I will sum up the most important information. Definition, difficulties, and the 6 confusion points of fascia. There are different sources for a definition of fascia, but we will take the source that focused on its research the most, the Fascia Research Society. Their definition is as follows. A fascia is a sheath, a sheet, or any other dissectable aggregation of connective tissue that forms beneath the skin to attach, enclose, and separate muscles and other internal organs. Or in short and really simplified, fascia is the fibrous-like tissue that surrounds basically everything. And with everything, I mean the skeletal muscle system, internal organs, blood vessels, and nervous system. But because they surround everything, it is difficult to give them an anatomical name. For example, from a macroscopical viewpoint, the bones have a clear solid shape and can easily be named like os femur. Muscles have a pretty distinct start and ending point and can also be differentiated from adjacent structures and even from adjacent muscles. Fasciae, however, rarely have a distinct starting and ending point, and they blend into each other from all possible directions. Imagine, for example, and a little exaggerated, that the biceps and triceps muscle tissue, or muscle fabric, would fuse together from the medial, lateral, proximal, and distal parts, but you are still tasked to give them 2 different anatomical names. Additionally, fasciae have an inconsistent form, or to be exact, thickness. It varies from being thin and fairly translucent, for example the fascia of the external oblique muscle, to being thick like a ligament, for example the thoracolumbar fascia. The inconsistent form and the borderless characteristic are the 2 main reasons why it is so difficult to define and anatomically name the different regions of fascia. And the consequence of these difficulties is that in the past, they led to disagreements in naming the anatomical structures, which led to inconsistent naming, which then makes it additionally harder to learn what fascia is and is not. During my research for fascia, I identified mainly 6 confusion points that made me struggle to clearly understand what anatomical structures can be called fascia. So let's discuss each of these confusion points. The first confusion point, superficial fascia and its existence. If we had the task to build the body from scratch, with the emphasis on the skeletal muscle part, we would start with the bones, continue with joints, muscles, fascia, then continue with a fatty layer that covers the whole body, and end with the skin. So, if we take a sample of the body and zoom in, we would have the muscles, the muscle fascia, the subcutaneous layer, or subcutis or hypodermis, and the skin as dermis and epidermis. Only in the abdominal region does a fibrous or membranous layer divide the subcutis into 2 layers. This is the composition that for a long time was thought to be true. So in 1983, when the FIPAT was updating the official anatomical term list, they introduced the terms fascia profundus, which describe the more dense fascia around muscles, and fascia superficialis, which describe the subcutaneous layer as a whole, including the fat tissue. That was the understanding of the anatomical terms at that time, at least in the English language, because in the French, Italian, and German area, the fat was not included as being part of fascia, because they saw fascia to be made of solely fibrous tissue, or to be more specific, of proper connective tissue, which I will talk about later. So in 1998, the FIPAD updated their nomenclature and withdrew the term superficial fascia and recommended the use of subcutis or hypodermis to describe the subcutaneous layer. But it was too late, since the usage of superficial fascia in the English-speaking area was widespread, so that the adaptation of the anatomic books to the recommendation of FIPAD took place basically 1 decade later. Even today, you see some sources that equate the superficial fascia with subcutaneous tissue. So I thought, in conclusion, just substitute superficial fascia with hypodermis, subcutis, or subcutaneous tissue, and forget that the term superficial fascia ever existed and everything is fine. Except no, because during my research I found studies, the first around 2006, that showed that the subcutis is actually divided into 2 layers through a fibrous membrane, so that we have a superficial subcutaneous adipose tissue and a deep subcutaneous adipose tissue. So, in addition to the deep muscle fascia that envelops the musculoskeletal system, we have this sheath that lies superficial to the muscle fascia, and therefore this structure is called superficial fascia. This arrangement was first discovered in 1809 by Scarpa in the abdominal region, and 1819 by Coles in the perineal region, because in those regions the superficial fascia was most predominant. For a long time it was thought that only these regions had this arrangement, but the newest studies show that the arrangement is present throughout the whole body, with a few exceptions, which can be categorized into 4 groups, as listed here. Second confusion point: eponyms of superficial fascia. As already mentioned, there were also eponyms present, which in general add work to learning the anatomical terms. In combination with the unclear definition of the superficial fascia, it was really confusing to understand what is going on. But since the term superficial fascia is properly defined, the eponyms are easier to grasp, even though in some sources there can still be different usage of the eponyms. Anyway, here's the list of them. Third confusion point: different views on the histological components of a fascia. Before we solve this confusion point, we need to make a small excursus into basic histology. If you want to build or construct any organ, you need the following 4 basic tissue types: epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nerve tissue. We will focus on the connective tissue by looking at the subtypes of it, whose division is also not very uniform in the literature. You can roughly say that there is an older subdivision, which was prevalent until around the year 2000, and a newer subdivision after the year 2000. As you can see, there have been some changes, but the one change I would like to highlight is that adipose tissue is no longer listed as a proper connective tissue subtype. This can explain why initially the whole subcutaneous tissue was called superficial fascia, because at that time adipose or fat tissue was considered to be a subdivision of loose proper connective tissue. But the bigger discussion is regarding the muscle fascia. There was a long dispute about what kind of dense connective tissue the fascia is characterized by: irregular, the favored term, or regular, which led to an additional factor of confusion. One example is the structures around the patella, which I will discuss later in this video when we clear all confusion points. Nowadays it is more or less decided that fascia is made up predominantly of both regular and irregular dense connective tissue, and by a smaller amount of loose connective tissue. How exactly they are organized, we will see in the next chapter. Fourth confusion point: the great overlap of muscle fascia with other similar structures. Even though the unclear definition of superficial fascia was my initial confusion point, the confusion around the muscle fascia was the far more difficult one, because of a great overlap of the terms. This is rooted again in the characteristic of fascia having blurry or even missing starting and ending points, which then leads to inaccurate anatomical namings and definitions. Especially the definitions of aponeurosis, muscle fascia, and epimysium have a lot of overlaps. This picture gets even more blurry because of a subdivision that you can make about the muscle fascia, aponeurotic fascia and epimysial fascia. So in order to have clarity, I first talk about the macroscopically similar terms, then about the microscopically ones, and finally I look at the definition and subtypes of a deep muscle fascia itself. The definitions of the macroscopical terms I divided into a macroscopical anatomical aspect and microscopical histological aspect. So ligaments are macroscopically fibrous tissues that connect two bones with each other. Histologically, they are mostly made of proper connective tissue with a subtype dense and regular. Tendons are also macroscopically fibrous tissues, but they connect bones with muscles. Histologically, they are mostly made of proper connective tissue with a subtype dense and regular as well. There are two types of tendons, tubular and flat tendons. The latter is also called aponeurosis and has basically the same characteristic that a tubular tendon has. Now to a new term that is not so widely known, myofascial expansions. These are fibrous tissues and functionally similar to tendons. But instead of connecting muscles with bones, they connect muscles with fascia. Myofascial expansions can also be divided into tubular and flat. The most famous tubular myofascial expansion is the lacertus fibrosus of musculus biceps brachii, which again doesn't insert into the bone but into the fascia, and in this situation into the antebrachial fascia. One function might be that myofascial expansions might stabilize the tendon and thereby reduce the stress at the bony insertions. Additionally, through the muscle contraction, the muscle stretches the fascia of a different muscle and therefore is able to transmit tension beyond the bony insertion. Histologically, they are also made of proper connective tissue with a subtype dense and regular. Now to the similar microscopical structures. Basically, each of the following structures is covered by a layer of dense, irregular connective tissue and has a special term respectively. Also, each of these dense connective tissues is continuous with another, so there is not a clear border where they stop. Even the epineuromeum of nerves is part of this continuum of dense connective tissue. They are basically only differentiated from another by what structure lies beneath them. Alright, with the definitions of the similar macroscopic and microscopic structures out of the way, we can now look at the definition of a subtype of the fascia, the muscle fascia. Muscle fascia are macroscopically fibrous tissues that envelop and organize the skeletal muscle system from head to toe. Histologically, they are composed of both subtypes of dense connective tissue, regular and irregular. There are two types of deep fascia. One, epimysial fascia. It is thin and sheaths its very own specific muscle and is strongly connected with a muscle it sheaths. Basically, every muscle has its own epimysial fascia. 2. Aponeurotic fascia. This type is thicker, envelops typically a group of muscles, or serves as an insertion of broad muscles, and is much easier to separate from the underlying muscles compared to epimysial fascia. The most prominent examples are the thoracolumbar fascia, rectus sheath, and all the deep fascia of the limbs. Now the question may rise, all the deep fascia of the limbs have an aponeurotic fascia, but the individual muscles of the limbs already have a fascia, the epimysial fascia. Now they get another macroscopical layer of fascia? And the answer is yes, they do. And this is the part where it gets complicated. Remember the term myofascial expansions some minutes earlier? These are the transitional structures called that connect the muscles with the fascia, or to be more exact, with the aponeurotic fascia. The muscles of the trunk send these myofascial expansions out and insert, but also kind of create or transition to the aponeurotic fascia of the limbs. It is important to note that the fascia of each limb is structurally a unit, and that the naming only occurs because of localization reasons. What I mean by this is that you can imagine the aponeurotic fascia like evening gloves or stockings putting on your four limbs and proximally tensioning them by the various myofascial insertions. Below this glove and above the epimysial fascia is a layer of loose connective tissue rich in hyaluronic acid, so that these two coatings can move independently from another. Still, the gloves are connected to the underlying muscles by myofascial expansions, not only around the transition area of the trunk and limb, but also around the other, more distal joints. That's the reason why the aponeurotic fascia of the limbs are considered to be mostly a composite of all the myofascial expansions. In an exaggerated way, you could even see it as a form of exoskeleton. Anyway, the aponeurotic fascia of the trunk, namely the rectus sheath and thoracolumbar fascia, are similar to that of the limbs in the sense that the aponeurotic fascia are tendinous structures that surround the muscles below them. So the rectus sheath surrounds the rectus abdominis, and the thoracolumbar fascia surrounds the apaxial muscles. Now let's take a look at the histological structure of these two types of fascia. The epimysial fascia consists of 3 layers, with a hyaluronic acid-rich layer in between them. In the internal layer, the collagen fibers are arranged irregularly. In the middle layer, there are thin, intertwined collagen fibers forming a network. And in the external layer, we have regularly arranged collagen fibers. The aponeurotic fascia is also made of 3 layers, with loose connective tissue between. But this time, the fibers are parallel, and the fibers of the adjacent layers are oriented along different directions, forming angles of 80 degrees. So compared to the ligaments, tendons, aponeurosis and myofascial expansions, which are characterized by parallel oriented collagen fibers, and compared to the periosteum, paratenon, perichondrium and epimysium, which are characterized by irregular oriented collagen fibers, the muscle fascia has aspects of both of them. While we completed the definitions of all the terms, it is necessary as the final step to discuss the differences between epimysium and epimysial fascia, and aponeurosis and aponeurotic fascia. The similarities between these 4 terms and the concept of myofascial expansions creating a second fascia around muscles are the 2 more specific points of why the understanding of muscle fascia is so difficult, compared to the general borderlessness and inaccurate naming that makes fascia difficult to understand as a whole. So, the epimysial fascia is made of 3 layers with loose connective tissue between them, and the epimysium is made of 1 layer. Approximately one can say that the epimysium is the internal layer of epimysial fascia, since in the literature both are described to be made of dense irregular connective tissue. Another difference I'd like to mention is that the epimysial fascia is a macroscopic term and epimysium a microscopic term. Or in simpler words, you can more or less see the epimysial fascia with the unaided eye, which means without a magnifying glass, while for epimysium you need a microscope to see it. Now to the difference between aponeurosis and aponeurotic fascia. The difference here follows a similar concept to the difference between epimysial and epimysial fascia. While the aponeurosis is a flat tendon that consists of one layer of regular connective tissue, the aponeurotic fascia consists of 3 layers of regular connective tissue, with each layer oriented in a different direction. Keep in mind that this time, the aponeurosis is not a sublayer of the aponeurotic fascia. Also, aponeurosis is a flat tendon, meaning that it connects bones with muscles, while the aponeurotic fascia is not a connection from muscle to bone, but rather a collective of myofascial expansions which connect muscle to fascia. Lastly, to the terms retinacula and intermuscular septa. Retinacula are a thickening of the aponeurotic fascia and are basically around all joints, at the front and at the back. The best known ones are the retinaculum patellae, mediale and laterale. They actually don't have a mechanical function by holding back the tendons below them, but more like a perceptive function, since the retinacula are the most highly innervated fascial tissues. The intermuscular septa divide the muscles in the limbs into compartments and contain neurovascular bundles. I found 2 descriptions for its origin. It is either originating from the inner surface of the aponeurotic fascia and inserting into the bone, or it is an extension of the epimysial fascia of the trunk, or it is a mixing of both. 5th confusion point: inaccurately named terms. Now that we have defined the generic anatomical terms, we can now turn our attention to the specific anatomical structures that are inaccurately named. The tractus iliotibialis, ligamentum carpium palmare, and the palmar and plantar aponeurosis are actually all fascia. Here you can already see how the naming leads to confusion, when for the fascia 3 different terms, tractus, ligamentum and aponeurosis, are used. The aponeurosis bicipitalis is also inaccurately named, but this time it is not a fascia, but a flat myofascial expansion, since it connects the biceps muscle with the antebrachial fascia. The rectus sheath, or in Latin vagina musculi recti abdominis, is actually an aponeurotic fascia, which leads us to the term aponeurosis in regard to the 3 lateral abdominal muscles. Since the tendinous fibers of these muscles do not insert into a bone, but into a fascia, the aponeurotic fascia of the rectus sheath, they should be called myofascial expansions. One of the biggest terms that made the topic of fascia difficult was the thoracolumbar fascia, because it was described as thick and with regular fiber arrangement. It always seemed to me that it had more in common with aponeurosis rather than other fascia. But since fascia aren't restricted to irregular dense connective tissue, and the thoracolumbar fascia fulfills the conditions for aponeurotic fascia, the thoracolumbar fascia can without a doubt be considered a fascia. Now the last part, the problem around the fibrous tissues around the patella. The ligamentum patellae does what it is supposed to do. It connects the bone patella with the bone tibia. But the ligamentum patellae is also considered to be a part of a quadriceps tendon, since it is essential for knee extension. This is because the patella is a sesamoid bone. These kind of bones have the special function that they improve the force transmission of muscle during movement. So it is a ligament, but it is also a tendon. Until now, all is relatively fine, but when the term retinaculum patellae comes into play, it gets confusing. The retinacula are often described as a band that holds the patellae or other structures like the extensor or flexor tendons of the digits of the hands, in place. The equation of ligaments or bands with retinacula is even more encouraged when terms of anatomical structures are changed from ligamentum to retinaculum. This equation would mean that the retinaculum patellae and all other retinacula have similar characteristics to ligaments, one of them being strictly made of regular dense connective tissue. This was the major reason why it was difficult to accept, at least for me, that the retinacula are actually a reinforcement of the aponeurotic fascia, which means that retinacula have 3 layers with loose connective tissue in between them, while ligaments are said to be only 1-layered. Before we discuss the 6th confusion point, I would recommend you take a short break here, if you haven't already, because the following chapters won't be as interconnected as the previous points. 6th confusion point: the functional aspect of fascia. In 2014, 3 years before the Fascia Research Society published the definition of fascia, the experts first met to discuss about it. While they were unable to agree on a definition, they were able to uncover another confusion point on why defining fascia was so difficult. They found out that fascia could be viewed from a morphological and from a functional viewpoint. The morphological researchers liked a narrower definition, while the functional researchers liked a wider one. Until now, we looked at the fascia from a structural, anatomical and histological perspective, but not from a functional one. The core of a functional perspective, as I can tell, is the principle of tensegrity. If you look at this simple constellation, you can see 2 parts: the wooden struts as the compressional elements and the bands as the tensional elements. On closer analysis, compression and tension always coexist inside each single element. However, the effect of compression clearly dominates in the overall behavior of the struts, and tensional deformation dominates in the bands. In tensegrity structures, the struts are not continuous with each other, and they don't transmit compression directly to each other, while the bands are all arranged in a continuous arrangement and directly distribute their tension load to all other tensional members. If you transfer this principle to the human body, you will have the bones as struts and basically all fibrous tissues as the bands. To this tensional network of fibrous tissue count not only the fascia, but also ligaments, joint capsules, and tendinous structures, like tubular tendons, aponeurosis, and myofascial expansions. Because of the tensegrity-like biomechanic, and because of the borderlessness of fascia with itself, but also with other fibrous tissues, the Fascia Research Society proposed this functional definition in the year 2017, updated in 2019. As you can see, the tensional network of the human body, a 3-dimensional fibrous continuum throughout the body, is named the fascial system. It incorporates the fascia, but also tendons and ligaments, basically all microscopical fibrous-like tissues, visceral fascia, meninges, as well as, kind of surprisingly, adipose tissue. In concrete terms, the functions of the tensional system or fascial system are force transmission, but also sensory functions, since many nerve fibers end in the fascia, and fluid transmission, mainly because of loose connective tissue, which is now also included in the definition of fascial system. While the definition of fascial system allows overlappings of fascia with all other fibrous tissues because of the common properties, the definition of fascia is histologically, macroscopically, and topographically pretty distinct and sets the functional aspects far into the background. One problem that emerges though is the question, What is the difference between the fascial system and the proper connective tissue? Because since the fascial system is made of structures that are mostly made of proper connective tissue, excluding adipose tissue, one might say that the two terms are synonymous. And this might have been the case if it weren't for the further clarification of the term fascial system in 2025. It is proposed that the fascial system should be considered as an anatomical system, consisting of 4 anatomical organs: superficial fascia, including the dermis and the adipose tissue of the subcutis, muscle-skeletal fascia, visceral fascia, including the submucosa, and neural fascia. The derivation of this thesis is as follows. One of the basic principles is that you can assess the organizational structure of a human body from 4 different zoom levels. The biggest zoom you have is at the cell level, then comes the tissue level, then the organ level, and lastly the system level. The smallest organization structure level builds the next one. A combination of cells with extracellular matrix and microfibers forms a specific tissue, a combination of tissues forms a specific organ, and a combination of organs forms a specific organ system. And so we come to the question, should the fascial system be classified as tissue, organ, or system? If a fascial system were to be considered a tissue, it would basically be a synonym for proper connective tissue, as we hinted earlier. The key difference between the two terms is that the fascial system includes nerve fibers that perceive the perceptual stimuli and blood vessels that are needed for the fascial system itself, while the term proper connective tissue does not include these structures at all. Okay, so can the fascial system be an organ? Since, just like an organ, the fascial system has its own innervation and blood supply? In general, an organ is a structural unit made of 2 or more of the 4 basic tissue types, and performs a particular main function. While the musculoskeletal fascia has definitely the function of force transmission, that cannot be easily said about the superficial or visceral fascia. Just like how in the digestive system, the intestine is for the resorption of nutrients, this is not the case for the stomach. Or take the subtypes of the integumentary system. It is obvious that the skin and the hair, an appendage of the skin, are not only different structural units, but they also have quite different functions. So let's see how the fascial system gets along with the definition of organ system. A system is defined as a group of 1 or more organs and associated tissues with related, as opposed to particular, functions. This level fits the fascial system better, since it allows more variability of the functions of its subtypes. Let's take the urinary and digestive system and compare it to the fascial system. The urinary system consists of 4 organs, but these organs have obviously different forms and also functions. The kidney produces urine, the ureter transports urine with peristaltic movement to the bladder saves the urine, and the ureter transports urine outside the body, but does not have a peristaltic movement. The distinct structures within an organ can anatomically be named. Using the example of a kidney, just by looking at its coronal cross-section, we can divide it into the cortex, medulla, and hilum, for example. When using a microscope, we can define other structures that are characteristic for the kidney, namely the glomeruli. Now we will look at the fascial system. As we saw in the urinary system, the organs within a system don't need to have a similar form. We also saw that an organ has its specific function. With these 2 points, we can divide the fascial system into 4 fascial organs, each with its own superordinate function. Still, it is possible that within an organ there can be different structures, as we saw in the kidney with the cortex and medulla. Transferred to the fascial system, the musculoskeletal fascia has the tendons, which predominantly take on a mechanical task, and the retinacula, which we learned focus more on a perspective task. Both the urinary and fascial system have terms for the microscopical anatomical department. But still, it is difficult to accept the fascial system as an anatomical system, mainly because structures like tendons, aponeurosis, ligaments, joint capsules, as well as epimysium and periosteum are already assigned to a different anatomical system, the skeletal, articular, and muscular system. Fortunately, it is not an exclusion criterion, because, for example, the pancreas is assigned to two anatomical systems as well, the digestive and endocrine system. Same applies to ovaries and testes, which are part of the genital and also the endocrine system. Another thing to consider is, if you look at the nerves, which are part of the nervous system, and at the blood vessels, which are part of a cardiovascular system. Even though the organs have nerves and blood vessels, and some organs even are functionally dependent on them, like the kidney or liver, it is said that the blood vessels and nerves primarily are not a part of that organ, and much less of that organ system. The blood vessels and nerves rather serve as a universal supply and regulatory network throughout the body, just as the fascial system does. Now that we, hopefully, understand why there are good reasons to consider the fascial system as an anatomical system, let us look at the proposal of the namings of its subtypes, or organs. While the terms visceral and nodal fascia are relatively new, the terms superficial and musculoskeletal are already known. If the term superficial fascia is used as an organ, what happens to the former structure that was called superficial fascia? The former structure could be called stratum membranosum, but the term superficial fascia is well established in the surgical field, so it will be difficult for the term stratum membranosum, or membranous layer, to replace the term superficial fascia completely. So alternatively, the former structure could retain its term superficial fascia, and instead the fascial organ would be called dermal fascia. A similar problem happens with the term musculoskeletal fascia. The authors used this term to sum up various terms of the fibrous tissues of the musculoskeletal system, from ligaments and tendons up to periosteum and epimysium, but they did not list the muscle fascia. And since the authors used musculoskeletal fascia as a synonym for deep fascia, I got the impression that again the name of a structure was taken to use it for an organ without giving a new name to the former structure. So my suggestion would be that the organ can be called musculoskeletal fascia, but the former structure should contain the name muscle fascia, and it should also contain the synonym deep fascia. Now a few words regarding why there might be resistance to including adipose tissue as well as dermis and submucosa in the fascial system. Throughout my research, the term fascia was closely bound to fibrous tissues microscopically and proper dense connective tissue microscopically. Both adipose tissue and loose connective tissue, which compose the dermis and submucosa, were secondary, even though they are in close relationship with dense connective tissue. Especially loose connective tissue is regularly met when we talk about fibrous tissues as a gel-like component that allows frictionless movement between the different fibrous layers, as we saw in the epimysial and aponeurotic fascia. There is even the term fascial interstitium in consideration to describe the loose connective tissue. Also, the terms dermis and submucosa can still be part of the original anatomical systems, the integument and digestive system, as we learned that one organ, or one part of an organ, can be part of two anatomical systems. Therefore, the inclusion of these terms in the fascial system is quite doable, even though the inclusion of adipose tissue in particular will need time to get used to. But as the authors were saying, the proposal does not include a detailed definition of each of the four new organs, as they find that further discussion and investigation are necessary for new definitions to be both precise and complete. One last point about an alternative view on the functionality of fascia from van der Waal. He proposed that because of the dissection process, especially in the older dissection protocols, artifacts happen, which lead to misinterpretation. He mentions the annular radial ligament as an example of ligaments that don't really exist. In his own words, when connective tissue saving dissection protocols are followed, it appears all too often that the so-called ligaments do not really exist in objective architectural reality, but rather emerge as an artifact of the dissection process itself. Van der Waal believes that muscle tissue and connective tissue are not organized in parallel but in series. For example, in the elbow joint, the traditional view is that first there is a connection between the bones because of the articular capsule, then come the ligaments, for example the collateral ligaments, and then come the muscles with the tendons. As you can see, they are in parallel, but van der Waal proposes that functionally the connective tissue and muscle tissue come back to back, so that they are in series. This functional unit should then be viewed as a whole and not as separate entities of either muscular or ligamentous tissue, and can therefore be called a dynamic ligament, or short, dynament. This last segment may have been confusing, but it should show that the reality is more complex. Nevertheless, the anatomical approach to indistinct structures is necessary, since only because of the anatomical naming are we able to communicate with each other about the mechanism of the human body. Open questions. Transition of muscle and tendinous structures. Even though we extensively discussed the fascia and fascial system and used several sources, there is still a weak point, or a little explained area, the transition of muscle to tendinous structures. Until now, the image is the following. We have muscles that are connected via the myotendinous junction to all forms of tendinous structures, like tendons, aponeurosis, and myofascial expansions. Both muscles and tendinous structures are enveloped by irregular dense connective tissue. For muscles, it is called epimysium, and for all tendinous structures, it is called peritenon. Muscles and myotendinous structures are supposedly enveloped by epimysial fascia, which has 3 layers with loose connective tissue between. Here, 3 simplifications were already made. 1. Applying the structure peritenon of tendons and aponeurosis into myofascial expansions. While in the book by Stecko and Schleib, it was mentioned that myofascial expansions were like other tendinous structures, it was not explicitly stated that the myofascial expansions are also enveloped by the peritenon. 2. Using only the term peritenon. The first irregular dense connective tissue that surrounds a tendon as a whole is actually called epitenon. Then a second layer follows, which is then called paratenon. The epitenon and paratenon together are called peritenon. One source mentions that between the epitenon and paratenon, fluid is found, which reduces the friction between the 2 layers. 3. Equating the epimysium with the internal layer of epimysial fascia. This is one of the most frustrating points in general. The contradiction is shown best by showing these 2 quotes from 2 studies published in the last 3 years. One study says that the deep fascia is an independent structure from the epimysium. But in the study, the subtypes of deep fascia, epimysial and aponeurotic fascia, were not mentioned, which could mean that the authors are saying that the aponeurotic fascia is an independent structure from the epimysial fascia. But even if we assumed they went with the idea that epimysial fascia is an independent structure from epimysium, in a different study, the epimysial fascia is described as a term used to encompass the terms epimysium, perimysium, and endomysium, which would mean that epimysial fascia and epimysium are dependent from another, and that the epimysium is a subtype of epimysial fascia. In the end, since both the internal layer of epimysial fascia and the epimysium are made of irregular dense connective tissue, and since the epimysium is thinner than the epimysial fascia, I concluded that epimysium is the internal layer of epimysial fascia. With the simplification revealed, some questions arise. 1. Which of these terms is epimysium in continuation with? The epitenon or paratenon? If the epitenon were continuous with the epimysium, which I conclude to be the internal layer of epimysial fascia, then that could mean that the fluid between epi and paratenon is the continuation of loose connective tissue of the epimysial fascia. But there are still 2 layers left of epimysial fascia to assign to the paratenon. Does the external layer get assigned to the paratenon and the intermediate layer vanish? Or is the arrangement different? And if the paratenon were to be continuous with the epimysium, are there still 2 more layers above the paratenon, just like it is for the epimysium? As you can see, in the first question emerges the second one. Does the epimysial fascia, a subtype of muscle fascia, have the same characteristic on the tendinous structures and ligaments as it has on muscles? And if it does, why call it epimysial fascia when epimysium is specific for muscles and when the epimysial fascia surrounds all skeletal muscle structures? Shouldn't it then be called something like peristructural fascia? The third open question is like the second one, but in regards with aponeurotic fascia. So we have our muscle, in this setting around the hip region with the quadriceps femoris. This sends out myofascial expansions. Together with other myofascial expansions, an aponeurotic fascia with 3 layers is created. Now we add the epimysial fascia of a muscle. We also learned that between the epimysial and aponeurotic fascia lies loose connective tissue to allow frictionless movement. The third question now is the following. If we assume that the epimysial fascia continues over the myofascial expansion, how does the epimysial fascia change during the transition of myofascial expansions to aponeurotic fascia? Does it continue over the aponeurotic fascia, or does it blend in with the aponeurotic fascia? The remaining information I divided into 3 groups. 1 I titled as additional info, like that the surgical field knew for a long time that the subcutaneous fat tissue, even in other areas than the abdomen, is divided by a membranous layer. When we have too complex information, which is directly about the anatomical structures of fascia, which I either simplified or left out completely, since it would have made understanding fascia more difficult. Examples are the term fascial interstitium, the subdivision of aponeurotic fascia into being in parallel and being in series with the muscles, and embryological reasons why some muscles don't have an epimysium. In the third group, I listed non-anatomical viewpoints from which you can investigate the fascia further. Also, I listed there all relevant terms regarding bursa and vagina tendinous, which may be seen as a specialized form of fascial interstitium, as well as terms regarding aponeurosis and retinaculum that are mentioned in the Terminologia Anatomica. These remaining infos and quotes regarding the different chapters in this video I have listed as a PDF document, which you can find in the description. The summary. In the first summary, I will sum up the content of this video chronologically, and in the second summary, I will make an overview of a fascial system. These summaries are a suggestion, so feel free to make adjustment if it fits your understanding better. So, fascia, in simple words, is defined as a fibrous-like tissue that surrounds basically everything. Its characteristic of being borderless and inconsistent in form makes it difficult to name its anatomical structures, which is why there were several disagreements and confusion points regarding fascia. The first confusion point exists because in the 80s, the name superficial fascia was used for the whole subcutis. Now it only describes the membranous layer, which divides the subcutis in superficial adipose tissue and deep adipose tissue. Also, it is prevalent in the whole body, with some exceptions that can be defined into 4 groups. The second confusion point are the eponyms. The third confusion point is about fascia from a histological viewpoint. One problem was the adipose tissue, that got moved from loose proper to specialized connective tissue. But the core problem is the dispute about muscle fascia and its components, which then leads to even more disagreements in naming. Nowadays it is said that muscle fascia is made of mostly regular dense, but at the same time also of irregular dense and loose connective tissue. The fourth confusion point is about the muscle fascia having great overlaps with especially epimysium and aponeurosis, which made it difficult to distinguish one from another. The naming of a subtype of muscle fascia into epimysial and aponeurotic fascia seemed confusing at first too, but the main difference is that the subtypes of muscle fascia, the epimysial and aponeurotic fascia, have 3 layers, while epimysium and aponeurosis describe only 1 layer. In this confusion point, we also learned the difficult concept of myofascial expansion, a connection from muscle to fascia, and we learned that the trunk sends these myofascial expansions out to create an additional envelopment around the muscles of the limbs, namely the aponeurotic fascia. In the fifth confusion point, we finally adjusted inaccurately named anatomical structures. In the end, there were 4 different terms used to describe fascia, 2 times the aponeurosis was used instead of myofascial expansions, thoracolumbar fascia being similar to aponeurosis, but in the end being really aponeurotic fascia, and retinacula being actually a thickening of aponeurotic fascia. In the 6th confusion point, we talked about the problems that arise when talking about fascia from a functional perspective. One problem was that there were 2 kinds of viewpoints to define the fascia: a morphological, very distinct way, and a functional, very broad way. The solution was to create 2 terms, the fascia and the fascial system. The idea behind the fascial system is the principle of tensegrity. The fascial system is seen as a 3-dimensional tensional network of all fibrous tissues, but it also includes adipose tissue and tissue with predominantly loose connective tissue, like dermis and submucosa. Here you can already see the contrast of the 2 terms, when one strictly refers to fibrous or proper and predominantly dense connective tissue, and the other also includes adipose and loose connective tissue. Another problem that arose was, what's the difference between the fascial system and proper connective tissue, except that the fascial system includes adipose tissue? And the answer was that in the fascial system and its organs, nerves and blood vessels are more or less included, whereas proper connective tissue does not include these at all. An area that still has some open questions is the muscle-tendinous-transition area. So we have our muscle, our tendinous structure, the myotendinous junction, the epimysium and the peritenon, and finally the epimysial fascia. The simplifications made here are the following. 1. Tendons, aponeurosis and myofascial expansions are put on the same level. 2. Peritenon is used instead of its two elements epi and paratenon. 3. Equating the internal layer of epimysial fascia with epimysium. The open questions now are the following. With which of these structures is the epimysium in continuation, the epitenon or the paratenon? Does the epimysial fascia, in addition to the muscles, also ensheath tendinous structures like aponeurosis and myofascial expansions? And if it does, how is the transition of epimysial fascia between myofascial expansion to aponeurotic fascia? Does it continue over the aponeurotic fascia, or does it blend in with the aponeurotic fascia? Lastly, I listed some residual information. Now, finally to the part that this video is all about, the overview of a fascial system. The fascial system is the three-dimensional tensional network of all fibrous tissues, including adipose tissue and tissue with predominantly loose connective tissue. Its functions are force transmission, sensory function, and fluid transmission. Its organs are the following: the neural fascia, visceral fascia, musculoskeletal fascia, and dermal or panicular fascia. We will focus on the latter two organs. If we build the body from outwards to inwards, we first have the epidermis. Then comes the dermal fascia. It can be subdivided into dermis and hypodermis or subcutis. The subcutis is divided by the superficial fascia into the superficial adipose tissue and deep adipose tissue. There are exceptions to the superficial fascia which can be categorized into four groups. Now to the musculoskeletal fascia, which can be divided into bones, joints and muscles. For the envelopment and for the connecting of these structures, the musculoskeletal fascia is responsible. We can categorize the following terms into macroscopic and microscopic terms. The macroscopic terms often connect the elements of a musculoskeletal system, while microscopic terms envelop these elements. The macroscopic terms are mostly made of regular and the microscopic terms of irregular connective tissue. Now to the macroscopic term muscle fascia, with its subtypes aponeurotic and epimysial fascia. The aponeurotic fascia is thick, the epimysium fascia is thin. The former envelopes a group of muscles and serves as an insertion point for muscles. The latter predominantly envelops its own specific muscle. The aponeurotic fascia consists mostly of regular dense connective tissue, while epimysial fascia consists of regular and irregular connective tissue. In both, loose connective tissue appears too. Lastly, to their respective similar terms. Both subtypes of fascia distinguish themselves from aponeurosis and epimysium by having three layers, while the structures that are called aponeurosis or epimysium are only one-layered. Additionally, the epimysium is most likely the internal layer of the epimysial fascia, and the aponeurotic fascia is created by a collective of myofascial expansions. Also, the retinaculum is a thickening of aponeurotic fascia with predominantly sensory function. Now the question may arise, what use has the proper definition of fascia from Fascia Research Society if we are not using the word fascia as a single word, but always as a combination like Fascial system, superficial fascia or muscle fascia. The fascia sums up the anatomical terms superficial fascia and muscle fascia. A good comparison is the term ligament. It is not only prevalent in the musculoskeletal system, but also in the visceral or gastrointestinal system. Alright guys, that was the topic around the fascia and the fascial system. I hope I could bring clarity around this topic, which is still under development. Thanks for watching and see you next time.